Thank you so much, Michael. I'm honored to be introduced by you, believe me. Michael, of course, has documented the history of much of broadcasting in Canada, a very important resource for all of us, and a wonderful resident for you here in London, Ontario. Well, Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, delighted to see so many people turning out. This is wonderful. And I arrived here in London last night. It was a gorgeous evening, as I'm sure you'll recall. So I went out for a walk, and I hadn't been in London for a couple of years. I'd driven past a lot on the 401, zooming to Windsor and Birmingham, Michigan, where we have relatives. But I had never actually been in the city for a while, and I appreciated once again what a beautiful place this is. Because I came out, I walked up Wellington Street, up to the City Hall, across the park, onto Clarence, over to Richmond, back down Dundas, back to Wellington. And I was looking on Dundas. I was here in the 50s for a summer job at Reward Shoe Store on Dundas. I couldn't find it. It's long gone, I'm sure. But nevertheless, I think it's a pizza parlor now. But that was a wonderful walk on a great night and gave me another appreciation of London. And of course, I passed the iconic grandeur of St. Paul's Cathedral. And St. Paul's speaks so much to the history and culture of this area, how important London is to the roots of southwestern Ontario. London, Canada, the Thames, London, England, the Thames. And you know, when I was living in Stratford, we never ever forgot that, because we were on the Little Thames at one time, the little guys, and then they changed the Thames, the Little Thames, to the Avon, and we became Stratford-on-Avon, not Avon, by the way. You don't say Avon if you're in Stratford, you say Avon, because that's what the locals called it. And at one time, Tyrone Guthrie was asked, he was the original director of the Stratford Festival. He was asked, well, shouldn't this now be Stratford-on-Avon, sir? He said, no, 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 no. We stick with what it's always been with the locals. It's got to be Stratford-on-Avon. So it remains Stratford-on-Avon. I know every once in a while somebody turns up in media and says Stratford-on-Avon, and I'm ready to say, that's what the locals call it, and that's now nailed in stone. It's Stratford-on-Avon. Well, I started, as Michael mentioned, in Stratford at the local radio station, CJCS. London, of course, just up the road. To us, it was the shimmering gem in southwestern Ontario. It was the place we all wanted to go, either to university, the University of Western Ontario, or in my case, to media here in London. I really worked hard to get over here because this was a big media center in southern Ontario, even at that time. You certainly didn't have the number of media outlets you have now, but I wanted to get here to CFPL. This was the Walter Blackburn empire, and he had the newspaper, and he had the radio station, and then they had FM shortly after that. And several broadcasters from CJCS had made that trek from Stratford to London. And I can name some of them. There was Tom Bird, who was the weatherman here on CFPL London for many, many years. Jeff Bingle, who finished his career, who began here in London from Stratford all those years ago, and finished his career here with CFPL and CFPL Radio. There was Bill Brady, of course. Many of you remember Bill. Now, Bill didn't come from Stratford, but he was in Sarnia, and then he was in Toronto on CKY. He ended up here in London and became a big London star, and eventually a manager at the radio station here. There was Jack Illman, who was the program director at CFPL here for many years, and he's the one actually who listened to my tape when I set it down. And I was waiting for this word from the program director, Jack Illman, CFPL London. What's he going to say? I sent the tape, I sent another tape, I sent another tape, and finally, on the third tape, I got an answer back. And it said more or less in effect, kid, you have some talent, but to come to London, you know, to come to London, you need a little more experience. And I was indeed just starting out. I'd only been in the business about a year and a half. So I went to Guelph. And then oddly enough, I flew right over London for my next job, which turned out to be with the CBC in Windsor. So I never did make it to London at that time. But nevertheless, I always remember the importance of London in my history, because Stratford was about 19,000 people. London was 60, jumping up to 100,000 in those days, growing, and a magnet for all of us in Stratford. And there was a wonderful jazz club here, the name of which I can't remember, and I was asking some people today and they couldn't remember either, but we used to come over as young people, and I remember driving the car, going back to Stratford in the dark, having visited the club in London. I don't have to tell you how lucky I was that, well, you know the rest, didn't get caught. Anyway, the book. When it came to write the book, people have been saying to me for years and years and years, when are you going to write a book, when are you going to write a book? And I kept putting it off, because being a southwestern Ontario boy and growing up with the mores of the time, which said to you, don't talk about yourself, you're to be seen and not heard, don't get too big for your britches, all those wonderful old expressions that I'm sure many of your mothers and fathers said to you were also said to me. And I also felt that, having been an observer of the parade all of those years, the passing parade as we say in the media, I was going to find it difficult to be in the parade myself and actually write about myself. So it took a while before I could figure out how to do this. Do I lift myself out of myself, put me out there and say, oh, I did this, I did that? What finally did it for me was that my editor at HarperCollins, a wonderful man by the name of Jim Gifford, he said, talk about your early life, which for me was somewhat painful. But what I was able to do when I got into it was look at it as an interesting story. And that personal narrative is what flows through the book from beginning to end. And all of the other elements that I touched upon over the years, historical, cultural, whatever, international, sort of flow into that personal narrative, which began in Stratford for me in 1934. That's when I was born. And my mother was over here much of the time to the St. Thomas Mental Hospital, and she had a lobotomy when I was 14 years old. And I deal with some of those painful times in the book, but I also wanted to tell you that for me, I had a wonderful, wonderful career. I don't know how it happened that I got bitten by the broadcasting bug, but I do recount that day in Stratford in 1946 when the Perth Regiment boys marched up the street coming home from the war. And when those bands started to play, and we were standing just below the platform of the commentators at CJCS, and when they started to speak describing the scene, I was swept away. And I loved being in the center of that event. And I guess the draw was to be near the center of what was going on all of my life. I was kind of a precocious kid in that way. I would elbow my way into places I shouldn't have been before. Indeed, into the radio station, until they threw me out when I was a kid, because the guys would want to bring their girlfriends up to the radio station on a Sunday afternoon, and there'd be this kid sitting there watching them work. They couldn't do that. They couldn't complain about the boss. They couldn't run downstairs for a drink at the Windsor Hotel. The radio station was above the Windsor Hotel beer parlor in Stratford, so they couldn't do that either. So, I was there and then I was gone. Also, when I was writing the book, some of my friends said, Lloyd, how are you going to do an interesting book? Because you spent 41 years of your life working every night. Other guys had time to go out and play around. And my friend Craig Oliver said, Lloyd, think of your friend Harvey. Harvey had, when I worked with Harvey for 7 years at CTV, we were a two-man anchor team from 1976 until about 83. And Harvey had 3 wives and 2 drunk driving charges. How do I match that? I've had 1 wife for 55 years and a couple of speeding tickets, and that was it. However, I learned a lot in broadcasting, and I am forever grateful for what I learned. And the first thing I learned was know what you're talking about before you open that switch to go on the air. We had a wonderful woman by the name of Edith Smith. She was the wife of the program director at CJCS, and she could not handle a typewriter very well. She and the typewriter could never get along. So she left me to read things in longhand, and then I would have to write them as a commercial afterward. And one day, she left me a long commercial about the danger of battery powders. Now, battery powders, some of you here may remember, there were days when you could open your battery, put the powders in, and then afterwards you could fill it up with water or whatever. But those powders were intended to help with the electricity system in your car. However, this auto shop owner in Stratford, Hugh McKellar, had decided that no, these batteries were ultimately bad for your car. So he wanted me to write a commercial about the danger of battery powders. I wrote a commercial about the glories of battery powder because I couldn't read her writing. Well, you can imagine the fuss. Edith spent many days in purple-faced rages every time she saw me, yelling at me. Station owner Pappy Squires was so angry he could only bluster and say I'd committed a fireable offense. Somehow I survived, and Edith and I were able to have a good laugh about it for many years after. So what I learned there was always know what you're talking about before you open that switch. Then in Guelph, I was the morning man, as I was in Stratford. In Stratford, I did about 3 or 4 different shows. Oh, by the way, if anybody out there is tweeting, Robertson is already getting boring, just remember that I can see you right up here. In Guelph, I was doing the morning show, and I learned another very important lesson, and this carried me forward for many, many years as I worked in television, especially doing the news. And it was about this. I was the morning man going in every morning at about 5:30 for a 5:45 sign-on, and I'd always zoom past a place called the 1-minute lunch. We eventually called it the 3-hour lunch in Guelph because they could never serve you in 1 minute. But anyway, there was this great big man who was there every morning, a rotund fellow with a dirty apron, and he would always grunt when I handed them the money, and I'd race up to the station. Then I figured out there was a way to get a few more winks of sleep. Very important for a morning broadcaster. So I arranged to run up, put on a long playing record. Now in those days, the longest playing record was about 3 minutes. And then I'd race down, grab the coffee, go back up. One morning, I heard click, the door locked behind me. And the audience was treated to a few minutes of that swoosh, swoosh, swoosh you hear as the record moves around its run-out groove before I got a hold of a friendly engineer, Jake Belligan, to come and rescue me from my dilemma. Well, I got away with that one. However, the next one, and this is where the lesson comes in, almost ended my career. I was due in the station for 5:45, and one morning, I got there at 7:10, 10 after 7. I really slept in. The phones were running off, they were going crazy, so I picked them off their hooks, dropped them in the wastepaper basket, and put on a record, dropping the needle into the middle of the record. And I remember to this day, it was Pretty Baby by Doris Day. And then I was heard coming on the air afterwards saying, "It's 11 minutes past 7, good morning everybody, it's a great morning in Guelph, blah, blah, blah," as though nothing had happened. And most people would think, oh, well, there must have been something wrong with my radio this morning because I didn't hear anything until that Doris Day song. Well, this was an old trick that I had picked up from years of radio station broadcasting lore. It was one of those stories handed down. Do you know that so-and-so did this at CFCF Montreal back in 1954 or 1952 it would have been in my case. And, if you're ever stuck, try this. Well, I was really stuck that morning, so I tried it. The only problem was we had a very experienced program director by the name of Donald Law. He walked in and challenged me and accused me of faking the sign-on, which of course I did. So I said right away, I confess, I'm guilty, and he marched me into the front office. There were 2 gentlemen sitting there. One was the station owner, the other was the manager. Fred Metcalf was the owner, and Wally Slatter was Fred Metcalf was the manager, Wally Slatter was the owner. So Fred said to me, "I think I have to order you to pack up your things and get out of here. This is a very serious offense." Fooling our listeners, bluffing our listeners like that. And Wally, who was a sort of a laid-back character, he looked at me and looked at Don LeBlanc and Fred and said, "You know what? I spent a lot of years in the services during the war in administrative jobs where I'd have to get up at 5 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and he said, those were the worst years of my life. So he said, Lloyd, you have one more chance. Well, of course, I sunk to the floor in relief and realized that he had saved my job, and I was forever grateful to him for it. But what that taught me was that it's never wise to bluff your audience. The next thing came when and this lesson arrived on my doorstep when I was moving from Guelph to Toronto, and I had to go down to take an audition at the CBC. And I took the bus from Guelph down to the bus depot in Toronto, and I walked up Jarvis Street. Now, Jarvis Street in those days, perhaps even today, was a pretty colorful street, for all the reasons that I'm sure you've heard about. So what I say is, it was only my second or third visit to the city, and on this occasion, I had to walk the 3 or 4 blocks from the bus depot to CBC headquarters on the storied Jarvis Street. I saw everything in a new light. To me, Toronto was not just big, it was big and exciting with a rhythmic hustle and bustle and a cornucopia of visual delight and exotic enterprise. While I considered myself somewhat worldly, despite not having been outside small-town Ontario, I was taken aback by the brazen nature of my first encounter with one of the city's working girls. Walking up Jarvis Street to my appointment in the middle of the afternoon, I was approached by a perky, attractive brunette who was wearing a tight, low-cut sweater that displayed her ample attributes and jeans she had been poured into. She offered a variety of sexual services on a graduated economic scale and seemed willing to bargain because I was, quote, a nice guy. Aware of the importance of my appointment that afternoon and imagining the echoes of my father's voice warning of the perils of loose women, I stammered something about not being able to participate right then, but I might see her on the way back. So she said, be sure and tell me about this important business of the day on the way back, Lloyd. And she said, she realized that this was a dodge. So I went and I did the audition, and I never saw her again. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. However, what I learned from that was focus, focus, focus when you've got important business on a certain day. One of the great delights in my career was being able to travel this country from east to west, north, south, sea to sea to sea in 1967, covering Centennial Year. I met Canadians all over the place, and while I had pretty well decided that I was going to stay here rather than move south, that one cemented this country in my genes as never before. I came to understand the idiosyncrasies of our regions and our people, and I fell in love with this wonderful land. Centennial Year was certainly a high point. I was pegged to do the opening of Expo 67, and CBS News with Walter Cronkite picked off the opening, edited my voice down with some of the pictures, and Walter Cronkite introduced me, here's Lloyd Robertson of the CBC in Montreal. And I froze. I mean, good grief. Here I am on the American networks. And that was on not July 1st, that was about April 21st, 1967. Also, while I was doing Expo this week, I was preparing nervously for an interview with Lester B. Pearson. I'd never met Pearson. This was 67. I was to do my first regular sit-down interview with him. Now, I'd met John Diefenbaker when I was in Ottawa, because I went from Guelph to Windsor to Winnipeg to Ottawa. It's all here in this book. But Diefenbaker, when I met him in Ottawa, it was always those hallway confrontations. I never actually did a sit-down interview with him. And of course he, as we know, was a very colorful character. And Dief would say to me, he'd wave his finger at me sometimes, always in a friendly way. He'd say, you're doing fine, young man, but you know those bosses of yours at the CBC? They're all liberal hacks. He also, as he became a kind of a pathetic figure later in life, but he was a great personality, a great character, and he always inhabited the halls of Parliament, always willing to talk to a camera or a microphone. And one of the last times I saw him was he was out of the leadership. He'd lost the leadership to Robert Stanfield, and his former executive assistant, Flora MacDonald, was running as the MP for the Conservatives in Kingston and the Islands. And he was upset about Flora. First of all, that she had abandoned him, and then that she was running under Robert Stanfield. And I saw him, he was passing this joke around, I'm sure, to all sorts of people. He says, "Oh yes, that Flora MacDonald, the finest woman ever to walk the streets of Kingston." Pearson, when I sat down with Mike Pearson, and I'll call him Mike because everybody else did. I didn't do that on the air, of course. It was Prime Minister Pearson on the air. But he came in with his jacket slung over his shoulder, and he said, "Hi, Lloyd, how's your rotten management?" And I was stunned at first. He was talking about a statement made by his Heritage Minister, Judy LaMarche, who was criticizing the CBC for the way they had handled the crisis over the 7 Days program. 7 Days was a very popular public affairs program, a groundbreaking one in Canadian broadcast history, in fact. But the Liberal government of the day wasn't happy about it because on Monday morning there would always be questions about something they had done which had come up the previous night on the 7 Days. So eventually it was taken off the air, but she was unhappy with the way the CBC brass had handled the whole exercise, so she described it as rotten management. So anyway, that broke the ice. We got into the interview, and he had a kind of worldly wisdom about him, which cut through the partisan nature which we're so accustomed to with politics now. And to me, Pearson was one of the best of the breed in terms of history of Canadian prime ministers. And he did a lot for this country, even though his government never achieved a majority from 1963 to 1968. But there was the Canadian flag, of course, which made us, made this symbol for this dynamic country of Canada. He boosted the healthcare system. And very, very important, he saw that if left to fester, Quebec separatism could become a dangerous force in this country. So he moved in with the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. He also went into Quebec to pick off some real Quebec stars of the day. Jean Marchand, Gérard Pelletier, and the one who went the furthest, of course, Pierre Trudeau. So when I'm asked about my favorite prime ministerial interview, I can always point to Lester Pearson. I was asked that, by the way, one time, the Canadian Club in Toronto, just last fall, and John Turner was in the audience. So I thought, oh boy. And they said, who was your favorite prime ministerial interview? Well, I did interview John Turner. In fact, John Turner and I became friends after a time because he liked the way we had treated him on CTV News. So I thought, oh, well, I'll take this plunge, and I mentioned the Pearson story, and he was nodding in agreement. Yes, that was fine. He liked Lester Pearson, too. I was there for the day that, on July 1st, 1967, when the bongs sounded 12 on the Peace Tower clock, and I was able to yell top of my voice to Canadians everywhere, or project, I should say, not yell. You project in broadcasting, you don't yell. Happy birthday, Canada, to the crowds on the Hill and across the country tuned in that night. What a moment to be on the air. The next afternoon, July 1st, 1967, I shared a broadcast with a strikingly beautiful young Chinese Canadian from Hong Kong who was just then beginning to soar as a rising star at the CBC. Adrienne Clarkson would go on to become Governor General 25 years later, but that day, she and I had to clamber our way up a set of rickety stairs leading to our broadcast platform on Parliament Hill. It was ladies first, of course, as I steadied the ladder and I moved up behind her. Just as she was about halfway up, a gust of wind. Oh, you know what's coming, don't you? A gust of wind on that warm summer afternoon lifted her beautiful sheer white skirt and exposed a considerable length of the future Gigi's shapely thigh. I assured Adrian I had averted my eyes. "Oh, sure, Lloyd," she said with a smile and a twinkle. And she and I have had many a laugh about that ever since. So what I learned from that little episode was it's okay to tell a little white lie if you have to. Now, I wanted also to mention something about my CBC years, because I know the CFPL was an affiliate of the CBC for many years before it became an independent. And I worked later with two of the stars here, Pat Murray, who was one of the early stars at CFPL, and Paul Soles, who for many years worked at PL and also went on to host Take 30 at the CBC. And the last time I saw him, by the way, he was acting at the Stratford Festival. I think acting was really Paul's first love, but he did enjoy television as well, and he was a great guy. So I had to decide in the book whether to get into this endless debate we have about the future of the CBC. And I decided not to, because it's a circular debate, and we're into it again now. Because I say that through all the fuss emanating from the TV side in those years, my old stomping ground of CBC Radio quietly and with impressive sure-footedness found a place for itself in the vast spectrum of media and remains highly regarded and treasured as an indispensable source of information and original Canadian entertainment. The same path should be available to CBC television. I don't pretend to have an answer to its ills. Many good people, much more equipped than I, have tried. Given its government funding and new demands for accountability, it desperately needs a clear purpose and direction. For too long, CBC television has swayed back and forth between whether it should look more like its brothers and sisters on the commercial side, with occasional breaks for programs like The Nature of Things, or be more clearly defined as a public broadcaster. It has dallied too long to find a middle ground between these two extremes. It comes as no surprise that calls for it to be distinctive are more urgent than ever. Let's be clear, Canada will always need a prominent national public broadcaster. And I say that only because while private radio got started very early here, and CBC was founded by a conservative government under R.B. Bennett as the CRBC in the early days, it was put in place as a national service to counter the signals that were pouring into Canada from American broadcasters. That was the original reason for the CBC in the first place. We had a smaller population then, but we were still dwarfed by the enormous population in the US. So it was a matter of protecting, again, something we still protect to this day and must, our Canadian cultural identity. And I think we still need it as we need the other networks we have to promote our Canadian cultural identity. I say it's a national broadcaster many people still cherish. At its best, it has faithfully reflected the Canadian experience through several generations, and is woven into our historical fabric. Its problems are surely fixable if its leadership, with sincere support from various levels of government and the Canadian people, can find the right vision and then pull behind it. I don't know what that vision is. Some people say it should be more like PBS. I know that CBC worries about its ratings because they're afraid, quite naturally, that if they don't, the government grant going to the CBC every year, which is $1.2 billion, 0.3 plus, will be cut off and they'll be sold or told to go in their own way. I don't know why they couldn't have fundraisers the way PBS does. I don't find them offensive. But some of the elites in the CBC felt, no, we don't want to plead for money. Far be it. And yet they can sell commercial time. So, I think there you go. When you get into the debate, it's circular, it's never ending, but we're into it again. I also, as I said, wanted to have a lot of fun with this book because I've had such a great career. And I know that there will be time for questions. Oh my goodness, Heidi, we're almost there. Time for questions. Let me jump then to a couple of remarks which I want to make about the future of things as I see it for television. And this comes in the last part of the book, where I mentioned my friend Michael. In a newspaper article in which he had kind things to say about my career, a former CTV colleague, Mike Nolan, now a professor emeritus at the University of Western Ontario, took a look at the often bewildering images changing the media landscape and concluded the network anchor has become a redundant messenger. Well, I don't think so. As I say in the book, I have to disagree with my friend on that point, because tweets may provide early alerts to potentially world-shaking events. YouTube and Facebook may give us the beginnings of documentation. Wikipedia may be a starting point for background research, but this kind of crowdsourcing, to use a current buzzword, is not an alternative to traditional coverage or a replacement for it. It is a supplement providing important, but at best, fragmentary glimpses of what's going on. I then go on to say that I believe that people will continue to look to their news professionals at CTV and elsewhere to pull the day's events together, at least for the foreseeable future. Now, I know that there are people out there saying, well, you can build your own newscast now, just go to your various sources, build your own newscast. Who has time to do that? I mean, this is where I think sometimes the bright lights, the gurus, lose track of one important thing, and that's human behavior. Because people work all day, we're busier now than we've ever been. They go home at night. The last thing they want to do is think about putting a newscast together. So they're prepared to leave that to the professionals. With hundreds of channels now available across the dial, making it more difficult to establish long-term relationships with audiences, anchors and interviewers may not have the influence they once had, but they will continue to serve a critical purpose. The audience expects them to be the guide through often confusing times. Viewers, listeners, and readers all treasure credibility. And a recent survey, well, a few years ago, to be honest, by the Canadian Media Consortium found that information provided by traditional news outlets is judged to be reliable and important and trustworthy by nearly 1 of 10 Canadians. Only 1 in 4 thinks information from social media is reliable. Now, on that point, very briefly about television, I know that I may be swimming against the tide and saying that TV has any future at all. Like so many of you, I've been following the debate about television's future. It's been dominated by doom and gloom. As early as 1992, one industry observer, writer George Gilder, was ready to take the extreme view that TV would be finished as a business and a device within 13 years, or at the end of the century that was, which is now 13 years ago. Well, a few weeks ago, I was sent a book by David Brennan, and it got to me thinking about the future directions for TV. Brennan worked at a senior level for ITV in Britain, which is the private television service, and he was head of strategic insight for the Associated Newspaper Group and senior executive of TV at Thinkbox, which was a marketing body for commercial TV in Britain. He starts off by noting that there are times in the last decade or so when TV's future has been less than secure. But not only has it survived in a way that would make the philosopher Wilhelm Nietzsche proud. What couldn't kill it has made it stronger. So what did the doomsdayers miss? Brennan contends they got it wrong because they looked only at the technology when they should have been looking at people. The reason for TV's continued strength is not about shiny new gadgets or shimmering technologies. It's about human behavior and people's habits. TV is still the national gathering place for big events. That's its great strength. If we have the me generation with kids all the time looking down at the devices in their hands, iPads, iPhones, etc., TV is the we component of the me generation. You wouldn't say, for example, hey, come on over and watch the Stanley Cup or the Super Bowl on my iPad or my iPhone. It's that need for common space that continues to drive the TV platform. And Nicholas Negroponte, who was one of the great gurus of media, said some time ago, and he was dead on correct, that we've got to stop thinking about TV as TV. And he was talking about the box in the corner. No, it is a program source, it is a platform. TV is the main driver for talking points on Twitter, key provider of content for iPhones and iPads, and is supporting those very devices that were supposed to have brought about its demise. I was around for its tentative beginnings in the 50s in this country, the kind of wonderful career I've had, and it's brought me the kind of life I've had. the kind of life it's been, which has been great. Thank you, and I'll take your questions.